Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the wisdom of Solomon, 1 Kings chapters 3 and 4. So far, we've seen Solomon becoming king. That was chapter 1. David had given him instructions, and then he had dealt with some of those leftover issues. That was all under Solomon's succession to the throne. Now we're going to see Solomon's wisdom, but also in there, at the beginning of chapter 4, we're going to see a section that focuses on Solomon's wealth. Chapter 3, verse 1, Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Now, Egypt at this time was well past the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. It was into one of those later dynasties, and this will be the 21st dynasty of Egypt. It's going to be Egypt that is not so great, and in the vacuum, Israel now is going to rise to become a nation of prominence, and that is seen as Solomon takes a princess of Egypt to be his bride. We know from our readings in other places throughout the ancient world that the idea of having a Egyptian bride as your, or Egyptian princess as your bride was considered, I guess we would say today, a trophy wife. That was considered a big thing, and it was a sign of Solomon's growing greatness. Chapter 3, verse 2, the people were still sacrificing on the high places, and notice how that's linked to his taking this Egyptian bride. That's going to come to the forefront maybe much later on in the Solomon story. They were still sacrificing on high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. They needed some place to sacrifice, and the only place that there was were high places. High places were associated not just with the worship of God, but the worship of the Canaanite gods. And verse 3, Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except there's this leftover issue. He sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. That was the place to do it. And we're going to see ultimately that's not a good place because there's too many associations with the pagan idolatry. But right now Solomon was doing that, not because he was trying to worship other gods, but because that was just the way everyone did things. Now, way back in the book of Numbers, when God had given Moses instructions about when you finally get into the land, he had said you're supposed to go in and demolish all their high places. And the fact that they were still worshiping in high places means that it had not taken place. There were these high places, these leftover places of the worship of the Canaanite gods that were still there. They were now being used to worship the God of Israel. But there was a bad association. Verse 4, the king went to Gibeon now to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. And if you remember, Gibeon had been that city that when Joshua had first come into the land, they had found a way to entice and maybe even trick Joshua into making a covenant with them. They had become water bearers and bearers of wood for the Israelites. And so Gibeon was a Canaanite city. It still had Canaanites in it. And notice it still had a high place. And yet Solomon is going there to offer offerings. Now he's not offering offerings to pagan idols or pagan gods. He's offering 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar, but he's offering them to the Lord. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, ask what you wish me to give you. Notice it's in a dream. We're going to have a couple dream sequences here early in 1 Kings, where the Lord is appearing to Solomon here in chapter 3. When we're going to get to chapter 9, we're going to have a second appearing. And so these serve as brackets for the entire life and ministry of Solomon. Verse 6, Solomon answers, Solomon said, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you, which, remember, that's not saying that David had been faultless. David had done some wrong things, but he had been steadfast in his love and devotion to the Lord. Notice he says, and you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Solomon realizes he's not even the firstborn son. There had been firstborns before him and even other older sons before him, but God had allowed him to be on the throne. Verse 7, Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. Now, we don't take that literally. He wasn't like a baby, but he was still young, and he knows that. Part of growing older is knowing what you don't know. Verse 8, Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart. And the Hebrew there, a lev shema. And the term there, literally a hearing heart. And understanding is understood. But give me a heart that hears you. To judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Notice he's giving God glory and asking that he might hear the voice of the Lord. Verse 10, It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And now God speaks in verse 11. God said to him, Because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment and to understand justice. That's, notice, not the same words before, but it's the same idea. Verse 12, Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before, nor shall one like you arise after you. You're going to be sort of, in a sense, one of a kind. Verse 13, I have also given you what you have not asked, things like riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you in all your days with regard to those things. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. That really depends up to you. Verse 15, Then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream, and just in case we forgot. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings, and made peace offerings, and made a feast for all the servants. Notice he leaves Gibeon, the place of the great high place, to come to Jerusalem, the place which will ultimately be a greater place of worship, and he worships the Lord here. Now, we see that wisdom next demonstrated, especially in one particular event. The event involves two women, chapter 3, verse 16. Then two women who were harlots came to the king. Now, they're not coming out of professional reasons. They're coming because they have something to judge between the two of them. They stood before the king. And notice, he would hear the cases of all, both small and great. And in this case, these are people that would not be considered of high esteem, and yet they bring their case before the king. And you know the story. They each have a child, and in the middle of the night, one of them had rolled over and had crushed her own child, and she got up in the middle of the night and switched it with that of her neighbor. And now they both come. There's one live child, and then there's one dead child, and they both are making their case. They are both claiming the child as their own. And the king said, Give me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. And it sounds very cold, but hey, fair is fair. Verse 26, Then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, Oh, my lord, give her the living child, but by no means kill him. And the other one said, He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. And you get to see the heart of each woman. And the king said, Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. And so he sees through the lie, but he sees through it by putting them to the test. Verse 28, here's the point of the whole story. When all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. And that's the point of the whole story, that the king administered justice. Now, chapter 4, verse 20, we read now that Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. And that reminds me of the promise that had been given in the Old Testament. You see, we read here that Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, from the border of Egypt to they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So from the river of Egypt, or from the river, just when you say just the river, that's the Euphrates River in the north, all the way down to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt, and everywhere they're serving Solomon. So Solomon is, now that's not the nation of Israel, that's the area over which he is exercising what we would call suzerainty, or exercising mastery over those other kings, those kings that are bringing him tribute. Now, as I said, that reminds us of the Old Testament, where God had made a covenant with Abram, saying to your descendants, I've given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. That was Solomon's kingdom, the same kingdom that had been promised. And remember what God had said to Abram? He had said, your seed will be as the sand of the seashore. And now that was being said about Solomon's kingdom. Here it is, now this is Exodus. This is God speaking to Moses. Again, the promise had been given to Israel. I will fix your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the river Euphrates, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you will drive them out before you. And indeed, now that's not saying every one of those kings was driven out, but it's saying that the same promise is being fulfilled that had been made to Abraham and then had been made again to the Israelites under Moses. And we read chapter 4, verse 22, Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal. That's a lot. 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. It's a time of plenty. For he had dominion over everything west of the river, from Tifsha even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river, and he had peace on all sides around about him. What David had won through warfare, Solomon has now bound together in peace. In fact, that's his name. Remember, Shalomo, it comes from our Hebrew word Solomon, shalom. It's the word for peace, and that is going to characterize his reign. And so we read 1 Kings 4:25. So Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Dan is as far as north you can go and still be in Israel. Yes, Solomon had suzerainty, he had mastery over other lands, but this is Israel's boundaries, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. And notice all throughout the land there is prosperity. That phrase, every man under his vine and his fig tree, we're going to see that repeated a number of times in the prophets, when the prophets are going to they're going to promise a future time of great prosperity when everyone will have his own vine, be under his own vine, under his fig tree. That's a picture of great prosperity. Chapter 4, verse 26, Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, 12,000 horsemen. Excuse the Freudian slip. That's an awful lot of stalls. We found some of those stalls, not nearly that many. And when we read the Septuagint reads slightly different, that Solomon had 4,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. It might be that the Masoretic text is a bit of a typo that has come down to us, that the original did read, as the Septuagint reads, that he had 4,000 stalls of horses. That sounds much more reasonable. Now that reminds us of the Old Testament injunction for kings. Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 16 had warned that kings were not to multiply. When you have a king, he was not to multiply horses for himself. And you say, well, gee, is that presented here as a problem? And it reminds us of the Psalm chapter 20 verse 7 that talk about how some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. And so we would ask, Solomon, are you beginning to boast in your riches instead of in the Lord? And I don't think that's necessarily happening yet, but maybe it's a preview of some bad things that are going to come. Chapter 4, verse 27, those deputies provided for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table, each in his month. He has a whole series of people that are providing These 12 deputies over 12 tribes, and each is paying their income tax, each at a different season. Verse 28, they also brought barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds to the place where it would be, each according to his charge. Verse 29, now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind like the sand that is on the seashore. We talked about his wisdom, his wealth, and now we're coming back to his wisdom. Verse 30, Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. And we name a bunch of men: Ethan the Ezrahite, Haman, Calcol, Darda. I don't know about these people, sons of Mahul. And his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. Solomon's wisdom, his mindset, his expertise was in many different areas. It was not limited to just one area. Many of us, we've become, if not experts, we've become students and maybe even scholars sometimes of one particular area. But there's a lot of other areas where we have basically very little knowledge. Solomon wasn't like that. Solomon's knowledge expanded to a great many areas. Verse 34, men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. And we're reminded in the New Testament how we're going to read of one greater than Solomon, how people traveled to hear Solomon's wisdom, but we have one who's greater than Solomon. So make sure that you listen to him. Next time we've already seen his succession to the throne. We've seen his wisdom and wealth. Next time we'll come back and look at Solomon building the temple.